All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Patty Wells, and I'm the editor of Arctic at the Arctic Institute of North America. And I want to welcome you particularly because this is the first speaker in our speaker series for 2019-20. But before I begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about the next two talks that will be happening before Christmas. In October, we're going to hear from the graduate students who received NSTP funding from Polar Knowledge Canada. So that's the Northern Science Training Program. And this will be a series of about 15-minute talks. And these are a great way to keep up with the far northern and Arctic research that's happening here at the University of Calgary. So if you want to hear about some interdisciplinary research, really, really current, it's a great talk to come to. And then in November, we're going to welcome Ryan Oliver, who's the founder of Keewatin. This is a nonprofit organization that incorporates science, technology, engineering, arts, and math into unique learning applications that promote storytelling, health, wellness, and growth in rural and remote communities, particularly in the Arctic. So, for instance, they create apps where kids can learn Inuktitut, and also they have video games, for instance, which are based on Inuit mythology. So it's fantastic, and Ryan has developed some of those. But this evening, we're welcoming Jacob Huffman, who's going to talk about some of the materials from the Arctic Institute's collection that he's been researching. Jacob is an undergraduate student in art history here at the University of Calgary, and he's been volunteering and working as a paid employee of the Arctic Institute for about a year. But as a volunteer, he's been cataloging the large collection donated to us from Margaret Hess's estate. And recently, he's worked on an interactive project called Soper's World, a journey into the Canadian Arctic through art. And this is focused on J. Dewey Soper's travels in the Arctic and the artwork he produced. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jacob. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me now? That's good. Okay, so the title of today's talk is Collecting North, an Incomplete History. And the goal of this presentation is to talk about a series of government-funded handicraft projects that went across the Arctic during the second half of the 20th century. One of the goals for the government was to help, is this cut off over here?
It is cut off, but that's okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
The government wanted to help Inuit communities become less reliant on the fur trade. Oh, look at that, nice and centralized. This presentation is going to start with a historical overview of Inuit handicraft. We're going to talk about the involvement of the government and some of the market factors that encourage the programs. And we're going to look at 3 case studies. The first, the Rankin Inlet ceramic shop. Is anyone familiar with Inuit ceramic art? Yes? That's good. And the Spence Bay Fashion Project, and it was for natural dyes. Again, anyone familiar? Mm-hmm. And then we're going to talk about some carvings from Arctic Bay. Everything that will be discussed, or the reasons we're talking about these 3 case studies in particular, is because they were of importance to Marmee Hess. Marmee Hess was a huge collector of Canadian art, modern art, and we received a massive donation from their estate. So all of these works that we have were made for sale and were personally selected by either Marmee or one of their collection advisors. So just to do an overview of pre-contact handicraft, both pre and Inuit handicraft was individual, sporadic, and it was untied to Western notions of art. There was a long tradition of decorative work, and carvings were made for amusement, toys, or various spiritual purposes. Here's one example photographed by patio over there. We see a walrus, which is about 1,500 years old from the Labrador region. So if you look at these squares here, each one of those is a centimeter. So just to give you some perspective, a credit card is 8.5 centimeters long. So if you guys want to take your credit cards out and leave them at the door. No? Okay. These are harpoon heads, but again, decorative, so they could have been hung by some leather or worn. And then this is a figurative representation of a bear. So it's from the top, and you can see the ears, and up there would be the eyes. But the early works that we start to see in collections are typically representations of camp life. Figures, these are page glued to a base, and they feature a lot of inlaid details. And sometimes you'll find black shoe polish was used to give some color to carvings. We start to see collections of work around the time of, well, you know, Arctic explorers collected a good amount. The Hudson's Bay Company traded and gathered a good amount. Here's 3 examples. So up here, for those who do not work in the Arctic, can you tell me what sex these 2 carvings would be? Does anyone know?
Female on the left, male on the right.
That is correct. And how do you know that?
I've been up there and I've got some myself.
That's a good reference, yes. One of the ways we can tell from carvings is this style of parka, as well as the hood, where an infant could have been kept. So these early collected works were sold to explorers, military personnel, RCMP, Hudson's Bay Company traders. The government was interested in developing this handicraft as a part of industry as early as 1927. The report for the Department of the Interior suggested that they trained the Inuit to create wooden puzzles, but they didn't end up actually getting much done because, you know, the Great Depression and the Second World War. We don't see widespread government involvement in Inuit handicraft until James Archibald Houston. I think this would be a familiar name to most people here, most famous for setting up the Cape Dorset print shop. But you know, before he did that, in 1948, he went on a trip to Inukjuak, which is northern Quebec. There he was given a dozen carvings, which the story goes he put on his mantle. Once he returned home, and his friends were saying to him, wow, you know, James, these are beautiful. You should exhibit these, you should share these. And eventually they exhibited at the Canadian Handicraft Guild in Montreal. Roaring success, and the Canadian Handicraft Guild secured $1,100 in Hudson's Bay Company chits for him to go back to Inukjuak and buy more carvings. At this time, Inukjuak had very bad luck in the fur trade, so that freed up a lot of time for people to carve. And a Hudson's Bay chit would just be, they look like these. If you ever find one, you should take it to an auctioneer immediately. They're very small, they don't look like it, but they're very valuable to collectors. And you can kind of get an idea of how the economies are working in these areas. Instead of cash, you're just trading Hudson's Bay chits. The Canadian Handicraft Guild, which sponsored Houston, was established in 1909. They had the goal to market and preserve handicraft all across Canada. Houston was in the right place at the right time. The federal government was looking for ideas and to develop Inuit handicraft for sale. And they came to an agreement with the Canadian Handicraft Guild to employ an instructor, preferably Houston, publish an instructional book in both Inuit syllabics and English, cooperate with the Northwest Territories Administration in the selection of sites. The government was very involved in selecting where these sites were given. They wanted to focus on regions which were experiencing economic hardship. And then they wanted to make sure that eventually all of these would become Inuit-owned, operated, and self-sustaining practices that would not require any government oversight. So Houston goes back up north, and he ends up collecting a ton. There was a very indiscriminate purchasing policy from the Canadian Handicraft Guild early on, and really started to fill up their warehouses. The moment this project was initiated, you saw a great deal of enthusiasm across the north and a big increase in carving. So as a way to market, to get these sold, get them out of the CHG warehouses, they set up the Canadian Eskimo Art Committee, founded in 1961. That was a group of arch advisors, consultants that were established at the request of the West Baffin Co-op to help market particularly screen prints. Canadian Arctic Producers, founded in 1965, initially established to market everything but screen prints. Just from the NFB, a little graphic, letting people know about the Canadian establishment. Yeah. And Canadian Arctic Producers, founded in 1965, we covered that. It operated as a subsidized private company. Alma Houston was the initial president, and they grew pretty quickly. They ended up in communities all across the north, and by 1970, they had over 700 distributors. Coinciding with this, you started to see Arctic co-ops, which were sponsored, sponsored by the Department of Northern Affairs and Natural Resources. They helped make money and equipment available to set up these co-ops. The first Inuit co-op was based in commercial fishing and logging in Arctic Quebec. The production of stone carving and prints became a part of co-ops pretty quickly, but not immediately. And here is a map I put together. It's interactive in case anybody does want a link. All of these indicate somewhere where a co-op was set up, but a handicraft co-op. So these handicraft projects, which operated throughout the 1960s and up to a lot of them continuing today, they were focusing on sewing, carving, making fur garments, prints, wall hangings, jewelry, knitting, sculptures and carvings, eider down, that would be the Arctic duck, and pottery. So pottery would have been done just over here in Rankin Inlet. Rankin Inlet was not a permanent settlement prior to the establishment of a nickel mine, which operated from 1957 to 1962. The federal government encouraged, sometimes strong-armed, and relocated Inuit to Rankin Inlet, and the places where they would have came from was Whale Cove, Arviat, Chesterfield Inlet, all along the Chelan River, the Back River, and a few from the Kazan River, smaller camps. So the mine brought a big economic boom to the community. It bursted to about 500 inhabitants, but there was really no plan for what to do once the mine closed. The nickel was found very high up at the surface, and they didn't necessarily check to make sure that it would continue to supply the economic demands of the growing community. When the mine shut down, the government tried to have the Inuit move back to wherever they came from, but they all said, no, this is our home, we live here, and they lobbied the government to help come up with new employment ideas. One of those being the Rankin Inlet Ceramics Workshop. So this was set up by Claude and Grenier, who operated the ceramics workshop, and his wife, Cecil, handled the sewing project over there. So they would have arrived in 1963. Why a ceramics workshop? You know, when people think about Inuit art, ceramics is not always the first thing that comes to their mind. But when they were looking for ideas, they hired, of course, government's always hiring advisors, a big group of art consultants. And these art consultants said, the soapstone in this region is pretty hard. We don't think that the carvers can get the same detail that they are achieving in other communities with this type of stone. Let's try something a little bit different. Another factor was, while Cape Dorset did try and have a pottery workshop, they didn't have the electricity. Having the mine established before provided enough hydroelectric power for the operation of a kiln. Here's an example of a work. Notice the bugs on the face. This one is 11 by 7 inches, so not too large. One thing that I can say is Dona Anorak, he was interviewed later in his life, and he comments on how when carving, it wasn't very social for people in the community, but they found working in the pottery workshop was more social, very collaborative, and he comments on how much laughter was going on in the rooms, as opposed to the carvings, which they found less fun. Some early issues, the clay didn't arrive for several months. The project wasn't sent any glazes, and the kiln arrived 2 years late. From the get-go, a lot of Sojourners were concerned about establishing an Inuit pottery project. At this time, it was debated if there was traditional usage of pottery amongst these communities. We do now know that Inuit did make pottery, but at the time, some people were concerned that it was introducing something that wasn't there before. And that idea kind of got into the minds of a lot of collectors. Here's some examples from Inuit Art Quarterly. So they made a lot of these massive, large heads. Notice how sculptural these works are, too. The Department of Northern Affairs was really hoping for objects which would have a functional utility, bowls, plates, mugs. This is not what they were expecting. These the ceramics that were produced had a large exhibition in Montreal called the Keewatin Eskimo Ceramics Exhibition. It was a critical success, but a big commercial failure. And so what happened was people loved the art, and I want to make that clear. A lot of the advisors liked the art, but they noticed that it wasn't selling, and that affected the morale of a lot of the Inuit who were working on the project, as well as led to concerns about the economic feasibility of the project. It's important to understand that these projects weren't established with the idea of art producing, but economic development. So Alistair McDuff, who was a supporter of the Pottery Project, and he said time and time again that he found them to be museum quality. He did not believe that they could sell. He didn't think that people would want to collect these works. When I was reading a retrospective document about why this project might have failed, and one of the first things that came up was, well, maybe we named it wrong. Maybe instead of calling it the Ceramics Project, we could have called it the Ceramic Sculpture Project. And I think that being the opener of your retrospective is kind of putting the blame off of yourself. So the project was closed in 1977. Exemplary pieces were sent to museums, but the majority of the stock was destroyed. Some of it was bought by collectors, Marmee Hess being one of them. We saw the photographs of what was being exhibited, so let's actually see what was bought. They were small. Here you can see the use of the coil technique that was very common in these ceramic workshops. This was bought. Again, you can see the use of the coil technique over here. This was by John Kavik, a well-known sculptor. Originally, these were muskox, and they had horns, but they've since broken off. So what was the legacy of this project? We can tell that the collectors were not buying necessarily what the Inuit were producing as art objects. They were buying smaller, maybe commemorative pieces from already established carvers. This is a soapstone carving by a John Kavik, and I would suggest that one of the reasons you see in his work so many holes is the experience of using clay. When you look at his ceramics, he would use his finger to create those holes for mouth or eyes, ears. There's still ceramics happening in Rankin Inlet today. In 1990, Matchbox Gallery revived it. They produce incredible work, and I'd really recommend you all go Google it. So now we're going to talk about Spence Bay. So Spence Bay was a permanent settlement. Well, no, it was established as a permanent settlement in 1948 after the Hudson's Bay Company relocated its Fort Ross trading post. The government sent a guy by the name of John McGrath to be the area's economic development officer, and he brought along his wife, Judy. Judy had experience working with natural dyes, and when she went to the Arctic, she continued her own practice and helped introduce it to the community. So the Spence Bay Project made natural dyes using flowers, berries, stems, branches, roots, barks, grasses, sledge, moss, seaweeds, and lichens. Really anything they could find. They would dye hairs and wools, which they would the wools would usually be bought from the Hudson's Bay Company or the community co-op. And then they would create embroidery thread and put designs into melting cloth fabrics. They did attempt to use Keewatin, that's muskox fur, but they found it was very soft and difficult to work with, so they were abandoned pretty early. And they shared a space with a photography project led by the artist Pamela Harris. Pamela Harris is an American-born but Canadian artist who went up to Spence Bay, sponsored in part by the government, but also Kodak Film, to help teach photography to the community. So this photograph was not taken by anyone involved in the Spence Bay Project, but by Boyd Waddell. These are mountain avens, and they were used to produce kind of like a light tan shade. Afterwards, I'll invite you guys all to come up, and you can see that exact light tan shade. And here's some photographs by Uktuki Taloyoak, who was a Spence Bay photographer. We have a pretty decent collection of their work, and I find it incredible. Here they are documenting people from the Spence Bay Project going to go pick plants and lichens. And then there they are in the workshop sewing with their embroidery thread. The Spence Bay Project was a favorite for the area's economic development officers, and a guy by the name of Kelvin D. Abrahamson, who was in charge of arts and crafts for the Northwest Territories in the 1970s, invited a friend of theirs, Marmee Hess, to help arrange an exhibition. Hess did arrange a number of exhibitions, including one in Calgary, Montreal, Toronto, New York, and Jerusalem. Here is Hess in Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem Hilton just over here, with a larger-than-life Barbie wearing a parka. And here are some photos from the runway. But they didn't just produce, fashion. They also made wall hangings. Here's a pillow, and they made toys. This toy is an example of Keewatin being used as natural dye. And again, two more toys. This is wool with natural dye, and then this is store-bought thread. Some of the challenges that was faced by the Spence Bay Project seems to be the lack of creative control. They don't produce very traditional designs, and there's a great story about the commissioner trying to send a photographer to document all the work that's being done in Spence Bay, and the community got very upset. They protested, saying, "Why do we need an outside photographer? We have our own photographers now." So you can tell that there was a little bit of conflict between the community and those trying to force a particular outcome. Eventually, the record goes to say that the project was shut down for environmental concerns. Spence Bay gets very, very little rain and has a very fragile ecosystem. Here you can see one of the dark rooms set up by Pamela Harris. Here's a photograph that was taken by Boyd Waddell. I'm very interested in this because if you look right here is a large diamond ring. It's been suggested to me that it wouldn't be outside of Marmee's character to have put that ring on the woman as a way to make him look married and, making a more appealing advertisement. The legacy. It helped grow the market for Inuit fashion. The Natural Dye Project was shut down, but you still do see a great deal of fabric art produced in Spence Bay. And then Arctic Bay. Hudson's Bay Trading Post brought Inuit to the area in 1936, but they didn't build a town until 1960. The co-op was founded in 1968. One of the founding members was the old Hudson's Bay Trading Post manager, a guy by the name of Eric Mitchell, and he was a big supporter of carving and developing a handicraft economy. Arctic Bay also benefited from some Pan-Arctic oil sites and the Nanisivik mine. So it had a few more opportunities for wage employment than other communities. And when you do a comparative analysis of all of these projects in all different communities, one of the things you'll find is that communities where there was alternatives to carving were late or slower to develop it. But another pattern you'll find is that communities that felt that they had something unique to offer would really get excited by that. They wanted to share their work. So in Arctic Bay, look at that great photo, huh? Beautiful. Arctic Bay, in 1962, they opened a quarry producing a type of soapstone called locally as kunik. So kunik is very easy to identify because of this. It has iron pyrite in it. As well, there was an old whaling station which they took a number of decaying and old whale bones to the community to carve. So there's a whalebone carving. A lot of the photos that you're going to see are from Army's has collections of this artist right over here, Penilu. Absolutely fantastic work. Here's one. What do you guys see? A whale? Do you see the bear eating the beluga? And there's a lot more abstract work here too. One of the byproducts of having the mine and the Pan-Arctic oil sites was being less dependent on your carving selling. So you start to see a lot of experimentation in this community. Here is an experimental, there was a material test for pink quartz. This one's about yay big. I don't think the pink quartz caught on very well, but it looks nice. Here's some references or things if you might want to read. And then do you guys have any questions? Yeah, what did you?
So the one photograph that Patty had, that you had up there, showed the
polar bear heads.
the polar. Why from the top down? Any thoughts?
They're actually, they are kind of unusual for, so they're dwarfed, and they're from Western Newfoundland. And that tradition of carving in that region is quite a bit different from elsewhere in the Arctic. So they're much more stylized. And they actually, if you flip them over, there would have been a hole that ran through it. So it would come from the back of the skull out through the mouth.
Yeah.
But because they couldn't put a hole through the whole thing, they actually cut an opening partway along the hole. So they'd have a little place here where they get a hole. Then this would be an open channel, and then the hole would come out. So they could have slid along something or hung from something.
Yeah.
But it is a completely different tradition there in that the pieces are often flat and they lack detail, as opposed to in the Arctic where you'll get kind of an absolutely standard 3D representation of polar bears. And there are lots of reasons why that might have been the case. Polar bears are not that unusual on the northern peninsula of Newfoundland, and they certainly are a huge subject of artistic endeavor in Newfoundland as well, but a different carving tradition altogether.
Okay. And you said they were all pre-contact, and then you said it was Newfoundland. So the Vikings were there.
The Vikings didn't arrive until 1,000 years ago.
So 1,000. So that's pre-Viking.
500 years prior to that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So the Inuit would have had contact with the Norse, but there's no evidence that they traded. They may have traded some artistic pieces, but it didn't generate a kind of an economic endeavor until we had people who were spending greater periods of time in the Arctic, and that whole stimulus to produce art for the sake of sale took off. So after 1927. Yeah.
And I have a question for Jacob.
Yeah.
So where did the Inuit get the ideas for the art that they did?
I have no
some
idea.
of it- some- what?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I can't answer that.
So you haven't seen anything
No.
where somebody went up there and said?
Yep.
The Spence Bay Photography Project, that was the Spence Bay, right? The Pamela Harris.
Yeah.
photography.
Yeah.
Was there any kind of economic feasibility to that? I mean,
I don't think that was actually started as an economic project. You know, I think that's one of the reasons it had private sponsorship by Kodak. The government did sponsor it as well, but I think Kodak would have been the primary sponsor. You know, one of the noted benefits of these projects was just helping the communities. You know.
fair,
So we don't know that as they made contact, that took up books of stuff for them to look at and
No, I
got
don't.
ideas
I don't
from-
think. I don't think so, because like if you look at the Dorset prints, they don't necessarily represent the changes to Inuit lifestyle. You know, and the carvings don't either. A lot of them tend to stick to mythology or natural subjects from the natural world.
But I do think that generally speaking, the colonial, you know, kind of the experience of colonization does shift some of the traditions of manufacturing objects for purposes other than their own purposes. So whereas a lot of the pre-contact period, those things would not necessarily have represented art, but would have represented aspects of relationships that people would have had with animals and their surroundings and things. And so it's clear that the kind of carvings that they did after contact still hold so many of those elements, but at the same time, they would not necessarily be producing so many dancing bears if the demand wasn't for dancing bears. And you see that across all of northern Canada, and British Columbia and all that. Should I be turning this on? I thought I was yelling in the background. So I think it's a real combination. I think that the thing about the Inuit is that they had an amazing material culture, and when something that they were not so familiar with arrived, such as Houston's print shop at Cape Dorset, they were just away to the races. They learned a technique, but in terms of what they did with it, and like the ceramics, in the pre-contact period, there are some examples of Inuit ceramics, but when they got access to these ceramics and they just decided to make these big, bold sculptures, so you know, it was such a response to an opportunity, and it was purely Inuit. Anybody else?
on the topic of those sculptures, how were they destroyed? Or why were they destroyed specifically?
Oh, they were destroyed because the government didn't think they could sell them.
But
So-
was it an issue of storage or like non-cataloging?
What you know, museums
Did they
only.
try and sell them?
They did try and sell them. Museums only have so much storage, and I think those collection managers of museums probably would have had the same biases as the collectors.
Okay.
And they would not necessarily have been seen as something to go. They would have been considered brand new, maybe manufactured within the last 5 years of leaving those places, and so museums wouldn't necessarily have felt a sense of responsibility to keep them.
One thing I've been trying to do is figure out where all of those Spence Bay, where all those outfit went. And it seems to me, I got an email today from someone who was saying that they think they saw Marmee had them in a Ziploc bag, and that it's likely they would have been thrown out. He also suggested that if it wasn't thrown out, he probably wouldn't have been in the best condition considering the Ziploc bag.
Any other questions?
I think James Houston said he threw a bunch in the sea.
Oh yeah, was that James Houston or was
Well,
that?
that is what I recall from a talk that he gave one time.
Mhm. No, there's definitely a story about that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what you were saying, Robert, is that you understand that there's a story that James Houston.
Well, he may have done it or he may have embellished the story, but I heard it from him.
Right. So they may not have even made it south before they were destroyed.
Oh, I don't think so, no. No, I think they were destroyed up there for
Mhm. Well, yeah, I mean, the carvings that weren't selected by southerners, you know, and government agents to be sent down south probably would have been destroyed.
So I'd like to thank Jacob for giving this talk. It's excellent. And I think there's so much more work to do on this collection and the other collections that are coming in. Hopefully we can keep Jacob around for longer.
I have
If we
nothing
find
to
enough
do.
money. So thanks a lot. And I think now if people would like, we'll raise the lights and you can come and look at some of the materials. So thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.